Meantime, I want you to listen to this. President Ronald Reagan, shortly after the Soviets shot down a Korean jetliner back in 1983, and then President Obama today on the downing of that Malaysian jet last week.
This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
Now's the time for President Putin and Russia to pivot away from the strategy that they've been taking and get serious about trying to resolve hostilities within Ukraine in a way that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and respects the right of the Ukrainian people to make their own decisions about their own lives.
All right. Do you notice a difference? Historian Jane Hampton-Cook certainly does. What is it, Jane?
Passion. Ronald Reagan had passion, and he was a student of the Soviet Union. He had really studied and read up on them and really understood who he was dealing with. And he used terms like barbaric, savagery. He used the term massacre 3 times in that speech. And you have pivot coming from President Obama. You have very muted, mild language in comparison between the two presidents.
I'm wondering, too, about whether not getting emotional at a time like this is wise or not wise. It wasn't as if Ronald Reagan was high-strung in 1983. Many critics at the time said his delayed response days after the downing of the South Korean jetliner was problematic. But you argue that when he did speak, and when any president speaks after a disaster of this magnitude, it better count for something, right?
Well, it should count for something because the American people are listening and they're questioning and they're looking for some guidance here. And back in 1983, we didn't have the preponderance of 24/7 news coverage, so the news cycle was different back then. But you know, today we also don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Is some of this milder language because of what may be going on negotiation-wise? You know, we did not know, and the American people didn't know in '83 that Reagan had just corresponded through letters with the Soviet premier, and they were going to agree to talk privately. No one knew that at the time, and of course that fell by the wayside with that plane crash in 1983. So you just don't know what's going on, but it seems like President Obama could step it up some and not hurt himself, if even in his own style and way of doing
Very
things.
cautious approach. And you look back at Ronald Reagan, from what I read at the time, what he was going through, Reagan, he was weighing all this, and despite the fact that we have many of his critics have said he has a shoot-from-the-hip cowboy mentality, he was actually very measured looking at this and not wanting to jump to conclusions. But when it became very clear what happened and how it happened and why it happened, then he was ready to go. We almost instantly knew the ramifications and what had gone on with the downing of this Malaysian air jet, and still reluctance on the part of the White House to spell it out and appreciate the gravity of it. And I've seen that in any number of crises that have erupted at the White House, just a sort of passive, almost medicinal approach to dealing with them.
Well, that's true. And one question to ask is, what is the end game here for President Obama with Russia? Is it just to get a ceasefire? Is it containment? We now, looking back at Ronald Reagan, he was trying to get the Soviets to a nuclear arms reduction treaty. And ultimately, he was hoping that the Soviet Union would end up in the ash heap of history in terms of communism. And so what's the end game? And I think that's a question that's worth asking and pursuing with President Obama when it comes to President Putin.
I like what you were saying there, that emotion sometimes counts for a lot. Being really enraged and showing it counts for a lot.
That's right, it does. It shows passion and care. It shows care.
Yeah, interesting. Jane, always good seeing you. Jane Hampton-Cook, historian extraordinaire. Meanwhile, do you think that